Okay, good morning, everyone. Um, Welcome to the partner call today. And as usual, what I will do is I'll just start off with a quick round of updates in terms of the product. But I think the main attraction for today's call is basically my friend Jason Whitehurst, who will essentially talk about EPSS. It's relevant from an MSP perspective because, yes, we did introduce EPSS last week into the product and we talked about it briefly. But what we would like is essentially a perspective of somebody like who works on it on a day-to-day basis in terms of what it means to basically manage things via the EPSS. And thanks, Jason, for doing this session. I will basically just quickly run through the updates, and then post that we can essentially go into Jason's session, and then please feel free to ask any questions that you may have during the course of the presentation. So very quickly from a product update perspective, this is one of the major features that we're basically releasing this week, and I will give you a little bit of background in terms of what this whole thing means. As a partner, you will be essentially be able to manage what version of the agent you want to deploy into your basically ecosystem. And we basically are giving you this interface, which is a global interface, where you can essentially say that whether you want to auto update to the latest version, in which case it will basically auto update, but you can essentially choose on a per company basis that you want to essentially stay on a particular version of the agent till you choose that they should be upgraded. And this will also help us in terms of releasing any new feature updates, etc., in the form of what is called a beta release, which you can choose whether you want to deploy to a certain company or not, choose not to deploy in a certain company. So this basically was a feature that's been asked for a very long time. It's taken us quite a bit of time to basically get this done, but we finally have it. And basically this is tested, and this basically will be rolled out this week. So you will have the capability of setting up this version. Now there is basically a two-pronged reason as to why we are doing this. One, of course, is basically being able to um, control the updates from your end, which is basically also important in certain compliance-based this thing. So, for example, in terms of any federal customers that you may have or HIPAA customers that you have, there is a requirement that you be able to control the versions of the agents and things don't auto-update. So this basically takes care of that. The second is that we are basically in the process of basically slowly releasing a new agent, which essentially will replace the existing agent, removes a lot of the shortcomings that we have with the external current agent, and basically comes up with a new architecture. But while we are rolling that out, we do not want to essentially kind of disrupt anything, and we talked about this earlier. So a lot of these agents that are basically going to be rolled out will be rolled out in the phased manner and basically be one company, two companies, and you can choose how you want to basically upgrade your clients as we move forward. So this essentially is the whole concept of the agent version. So you will, of course, see if you want to maintain status quo right now, just basically choose that my default agent version is latest, and that will be exactly how it operates today. But you have the option of basically saying that I'll upgrade my MSP to the latest version, see how it works for a couple of days, and then choose to deploy to the remaining locations. Those can essentially be put in over here. So that's one of the features that we've essentially put in. The second is that there was a request for online offline indication for on a particular asset to know whether it is online or offline at that particular point of time. So that essentially has been added. So also basically when was the last sync time that basically we could reach from the asset, that has been added right into those details. The other thing which essentially we added is the ability to essentially launch your ticket. So basically whether it's ConnectWise, Autotask, when we create a ticket in this system, so we would realize that a lot of times you have to copy the ticket number from here and take it to the other system. So to just avoid this whole copy and paste that we were doing, we essentially allow you to just click on the ticket and it will open up this thing. So if you're already logged in, it will open up the ticket directly. If you're not logged in, then you will essentially have to log in and to your PSA and basically do that particular ticket. So the next one is basically one of the things that a lot of people requested for is essentially to look at what are the assigned users in the Azure Active Directory. So now we basically show you all the licenses that are assigned to a particular user, and basically also give you all the details in when you go into a particular details page. The Other thing is that we also added a whole bunch of dashboards because we added a number of features, but the dashboards were not updated. So you have the PIS scan dashboard, which basically shows you a whole bunch of data in terms of metrics that are required for PI scan. We have an external scan dashboard, which basically shows you all the metrics from external scan. This was missing. While we had the external scan reports, you didn't essentially have a summary view, which was basically expressed as a dashboard. You also have basically external scan by company. So you can essentially see by company what are the metrics in terms of what is the grade, how many critical vulnerabilities, high, low, etc., and what are the count of ports which are open, all of those pieces. We also have a remediation summary dashboard, which talks about how many software remediations are open and are trending across companies. And plus, basically, we have a detailed table in terms of what are the remediations by asset and basically a particular application. So you can essentially download this and basically use this beyond just the remediation table that we have. In the remediation summary, we also talk about like how much time does it take to basically remediate a particular software. So that way, it basically kind of gives you an average of how much time it is taking for the remediation to take place. And one of the reasons that we are essentially creating these dashboards as we this thing, because we have our AI engine, which is running in the backend, it will essentially now be able to give us a kind of a benchmark in terms of how long is it taking for our MSPs to essentially kind of remediate certain, like all the third-party products. And then we can essentially give guidance based on that, saying that this is how long it's going to take for this to be remediated, and then for us to bucketize those pieces. So essentially, it also works to basically kind of give some more intelligence to the product rather than just basically the product being just a static product. And then basically we also have all the closures by application. So what are the software remediations that have been closed by application, and what are the count of those closed remediations is what we are basically looking at. And then basically one of the common asks in the report scheduler was that you want to be able to run the reports on the last day of every month, and that essentially is now being provided. So you can essentially do this as part of the report scheduler as well as this thing, a scan. Then in the external scan results, a lot of you have asked for the ability to basically be export that as a report. That essentially has been added. So you can just click on that icon and it basically downloads the report. And of course, we have a whole bunch of reports that are now available PDF with its browser extensions, asset discovers in 48 hours. What are the patches which are missing from an asset level? All the users that are there in different assets, the local users, unsupported OS list, Active Directory login failures for the last 30 days, and Active Directory computers, user data, AD groups, AD role assignments, AD logs, directory attempts. So all of that essentially has been this thing. Last week, there was a certain set of comments which was talking about like the ticker basically kind of, when we have the ticker, it basically blocks out certain views and basically it was not in the right position. So that's essentially been modified. So you essentially have the ability to kind of, it's in the top bar. So it does not affect anything that you're doing below in terms of the content area. So these were kind of the this thing. So now very quickly switching gears and basically handing over to the star of the show, Jason Whitehurst. We basically talked about EPSS scoring last week. Again, EPSS scoring is a mechanism for scoring your vulnerabilities so that you can essentially prioritize them. And it basically kind of uses a whole bunch of metrics such as MITRE, text-based tags, count of exploitability, etc. So this essentially is what we basically added into the system. But I'll let Jason take it on from here and basically kind of give us an overview of how an MSP can utilize the EPSS score. On to you, Jason.
I was hoping my green screen worked better than this big old blob in the back, but we'll do what we can. Can everybody hear me? Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, and Peter, I'm not doing this again unless I get a big fat green turtle behind me. So put it in the mail.
We're going to ship one out to you in Texas.
That is sharp, brother. That is sharp. Yeah, that's really cool looking. So look, let's talk a little bit about, I don't expect that any of you know me, so I don't set that expectation. So let me talk a little bit about what I do and why I do some of these, for the Connect Secure folks. So I own an MSSP that only sells to MSPs, and we have a full stack of solutions, but I would say by and large, our most critical platform is Connect Secure, and we've been working with Shri and Shiva for the better part of a year and a half on the platform. And by working, I simply mean we use it with our clients and we provide feedback. There are some folks in this meeting who provide significantly more feedback than I do. It's just that I have 200 MSP clients, and so what I see is a wealth of MSPs from $20 million down to a one-man shops that can translate some of that information to the Connect Secure folks. As to what we see in bulk, right? It's just a bulk view versus a single person view, and that really has a lot to do with it. And we do a number of other things with them, but the topic of this meeting is more related to, the addition of, the addition of the exploit prediction scoring system. Now, I did have some really cool slides done that jump out like I like to do, but I was horribly sick the last 24 hours. And so I'm going to do without some slides today and talk through it. So I hope you guys can forgive me on that part. I noticed that in the addition of EPSS within the Connect Secure platform, what I noticed happened is it immediately created this huge amount of conversation about what it is and what it does and how it works and how it's applicable and its and its criticality and its capability. And most of the people that were talking never heard of it before the day that it was put in the platform. So some of that conversation back and forth was really more fact finding for folks, right? So let me kind of clarify some things for people. EPSS, first of all, let me go back. Try to find a platform at any cost that has everything that was mentioned today and whatever else is available in Connect Secure. I don't know of one. And yet at the same time, it continues to be iterated on, and product core functionality continues to be added. And, functions like, agent uptime, red or green dots, or, the number of other things that were mentioned this morning are just from customer feedback. And these other vendors, you get added to their sprints and you might see it in 6 months if you're lucky. And so what happens when a company iterates that quickly is that it creates a lot of back and forth and questions around how that service actually works and whether it makes sense for that MSP to use it. So let me take EPSS for those of you that are here for the short version, and let me break it down for you based upon my feedback and as a security architect, what I see. In talking with the clients that we have that track their patching efforts in their tickets by time entry and can provide that level of telemetry, what we have noticed is that critical and non-critical patching efforts by these MSPs has increased on average about 30% of time involvement over the last 12 months. So that means that their top line margin is impacted by the amount of patching they're having to do, which continues to increase and continues to increase. Now, that's a byproduct of both, a huge increase of CVSS, but also a significant increase in these applications being able to patch these third-party and Microsoft applications. I think those of you who've been around a while know that RMM used to patch 10, 12 third-party applications, maybe. right? And now they're patching 70, 80, or more third-party applications. So what that creates then is this dichotomy between the patch identification and the ability to patch it, which then has a required effort attached to it. And then a team of people that have to remediate it if the patch fails, and have to redeploy and have to pull the application and redeploy the application. So when one says, hey, I've upgraded my patch mojo, now I can patch significantly more applications, all of a sudden the work product that's required to do that successfully increases exponentially as well. So when we look at EPSS, what EPSS is best at is allowing you, the owner, to filter out the background noise and to look at what has the highest potential of exploitability, act upon that effort, and be able to present that to your client so that the noise of patch reports doesn't impact your relationship or your discussions with them, right? Now, we have about 400 some odd SMBs in our environment, but I don't have any that I can show you, unfortunately, to show you some of the things that I'm talking about, in a production environment. But when you look at the slider for EPSS scoring, it only presents what you've highlighted, whether that's, the 3 different variables. And when it says, and this is something else that I've noticed, it says very high likelihood of exploitability in 3 days. Right. And then it shows a list of those patches that fall within that category. So let me just be clear and say, in the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence, right? So, and I didn't come up with that on my own. Wish I did, but that's actually on the first.org's website about how they explain how EPSS works, right? So, when we look at the exploitability of a particular compromise, that is algorithmically data-driven. It has nothing to do with the number of compromises that have been in the wild. Well, I'll tell you what, let me show you a graphic that explains where it lands in the risk model. And then we'll come back to the discussion. And if there's any one of these presentations where I really, am interested in feedback, it's this one, right? Yeah, so somebody asked the website, for kind of where that comes from, and it's first.org. Yeah, that's right, Tim. Well, Tim actually provided the full path, so thanks. Let me pull up what I want to show everybody. So when we look at where EPSS falls within the loss scenario of a compromise, what we're looking at is it falls strictly within the threat side. It's not looking at the asset side. It's not looking at the observable loss events. There's some confusion around that. It's not looking at observable loss events. It's not looking at what the cost is, what the reaction from people is. It's strictly looking at what I might consider pre-compromise. And we'll go over a little bit algorithmically how it pulls that data together. So if we look at the model of coverage and efficiency, right? This is comparing, if you look at the red at the bottom, that's CVSS3, and then we're looking at the precision of, how precise, whether or not that vulnerability is going to be compromised or not. Then we look at, what EPSS is adding to that. Remember, it's an additive function. So it's looking at CVSS3, and it's looking at the compromise thresholds, or the way those are risk rated. And then it's comparing that data to other algorithmic data that it pulls from a multitude of sources. And it's able to more efficiently determine whether or not that compromise is likely, or whether or not that risk is likely to be compromised, right? And so not only does that allow you, as Shiva said early on, right, does not only does that allow you to determine what patches you're going to spend your time on, but it also determines, if you're dealing with a compromise that may show up later on down the road, right? The likelihood that that compromise is going to have the total effect that it would have in an unpatched environment, it can also be reduced. And so if that patch is a part of a compromise chain, then that compromise is reduced in its efficacy, right? And so this is how EPSS looks at it themselves, right? They're looking at it is they increase the efficiency of the risk rating and how likely something is to be compromised based upon not only just the CVSS name, but also other conditions within your environment. And we'll go over some of those here in just a second. Let me come back to what else I wanted to present to you. So when we look at, well, let me come back to this other chart here, just a minute. Okay. So when we're looking at, so the question is, what do we do with it? Well, if you think about EPSS as kind of a pre-threat intelligence, they say that their detection systems, and by extension, their threat intelligence, they only report what they are programmed to look for, and then only what they can observe. So, for any given time period, this is what they say. Vulnerability feeds can only describe a vulnerability in one of two ways. Either it's known to be actively exploited, or we don't know because we haven't observed it happening before. So it uses that data. Has it been exploited or not in the past? If it has, then that risk rating goes up significantly. So EPSS is a measure of threat, and it's looking at the probability that that vulnerability will experience an exploitation activity in the wild. And then it looks at it during the time period, 3 days, 7 days, 30 days, 90 days, right? And if you look at the first.org site and you're looking for real-time data for whatever reason, you may want to be looking at a particular threat or a particular CVE. What you can do, let me get back to this page here. What you can do is you can look at what's called shifting variables. And those are shifting scores that shift throughout an active time period. So we can see that we have the top rated CVEs for the last 2 days, mean the highest rated CVEs published in the last 48 hours, the most risky, right? The ones that have the highest risk rating. And then we can see that the CVEs with shifting EPSS scores. So the EPSS scores aren't a flat number, right? Those numbers shift and change based upon compromises in the wild. So let's go back and look at the VMware View or VMware Horizon risk. So VMware Horizon had a pretty significant vulnerability, and those folks that used VMware View needed to patch that environment immediately, right? Now, we had a client that used it. Now, when we looked at what patches or what the risk what the risk data was available on Connect Secure within that environment, right? It didn't show that VMware View vulnerability or that patch needed to be done. And that was mainly because these guys have to use a 90th percentile rule when they're looking at patches and risks or CVEs and patches that are due. And VMware View was so low down that list because so few people used it that it just wasn't presented in that dashboard. And so that was addressed by some rule change or some changes in rule sets, but also looking at EPSS can help deal with that, right? Because if in fact those threats are particularly risky and they've been compromised frequently, and the risk to compromise is extremely high based upon other data, successful attacks, compromise attempts, firewall log data, data from a multitude. They don't necessarily list all the forensic sources that they get data from, but that's how they risk analyze it, right? And some things I would remember, EPSS has only been around since 2019. And so, not very many folks will know what that is. If you operate within a compliance environment, FFIEC, NCUA, FTC, any of these other, groups, HIPAA for that matter, and you're dealing with compliance and you're providing patch data that's based upon EPSS scores. You may have a difficult time explaining that to these compliance folks because they are unaware of what EPSS is or does at the moment, right? They don't have that in their risk, in their reporting mechanisms, or when they ask for a patching report and you show a number of low criticality, low EPSS score patches that you haven't addressed yet, maybe graphics drivers or something to that matter, they may consider that a failure in patching effort when in fact it is not. So when we look at, from an MSP perspective, when we look at the EPSS dashboard, what we notice is even with folks that have a significant amount of data in their remediation plan, that when we filter that by EPSS score, what we often find is that there's very little or nothing in the first two areas of criticality, right? And so what that means is that the patches that are left, and there may be many, many of them, there is no indicator of compromise present that's been used, that there's no compromise in the wild for that vulnerability that can be detected or has been detected, and that there's no evidence that that compromise has been effective in any way if there was one, right? It's kind of like the recent, hullabaloo around the threats related to, or the compromise related to 3CX, and we had some of our larger clients on the phone and they were really kind of wound up about it. And it's like, look, we're doing what we can, to your stuff's already isolated from your production network anyway, but look, this was leveraged by the North Koreans to attack critical infrastructure, right? And you're a finance business. I wouldn't worry about it too much. And so it's also important to look at who the client is and what the, what the risk to them is, if they're of interest at all to the threat actors that created the compromise, that leveraged the CVE risk, right? That's also critically important. And so when we look at CVE and we put that data in front of our clients, what we're working on, with our clients is to present the data that comes from EPSS and not necessarily the standard patch report that they don't really look at most of the time anyway. I think you would agree with me. And we would be able to architect a report that shows the real risk to that environment. And for most of you, I would imagine that risk is incredibly low when we look at it related to EPSS. So, I did read in the latest notes release of updates from Connect Secure that the patching engine has come up again, and that's to be updated and such that folks will be able to release patches from within Connect Secure that maybe relate to EPSS criticality and kind of close that loop. Peter or Shiva, did you guys want to comment on the patching side or kind of that latest notice that was put on the release docs? All right.
Sure, you got
Shiva,
anything to add on there?
I kind of caught him off guard. I may have been on the phone or something. So when we talk about the way that the patch engine works, that kind of closes the loop. So the other thing that we're doing is we're looking at these clients that are under compliance control. And I've reached out to the examiners for the FFIEC, which deals with banks, the NCUA, which deals with credit unions, the SEC, the Security and Exchange Commission, that deals with registered investment advisors. And we go through a number of exams with them a year as their CISOs. And we've reached out to them and asked them, is EPSS an acceptable way to deal with patching from a criticality perspective? And we're waiting to hear back from them, from some official word. I don't do healthcare CISO work, so I wouldn't know who to ask. But from a finance perspective, we've certainly asked around kind of about that. Now, EPSS scores can be pulled via API. It can also be manually downloaded from the first.org site. So if for some reason you wanted to manually pull that data, you certainly can do that. The other part is the other exciting part for us is we're closing the loop here. We're taking the risk data, the CVE data. That CVE data is then concatenated and compared against EPSS. That data is then submitted along with the asset data to our Blue Shift SOAR platform. And it's connected in real time via API to those clients where they have both our SOAR platform and our SOC and Connect Secure. And so the US-based SOC then is able to look at the potential compromises in the environment based upon EPSS score. So if they see something that trickles in a heartbeat or a storyline that comes up from an endpoint, they can compare that to the CVEs that are present in that environment. And so now instead of looking at all the CVEs, they're simply doing it by EPSS. And we feel like that's an acceptable range or an acceptable way to handle that. So this all goes back to reducing the time we have to spend on patching and presenting that risk data to our clients in our QBRs or our monthly reoccurring revenue or an MRR in our monthly meetings with our clients. So before I kind of talk about how I was going to talk about the measurements and how they work related to MSPs. Does anybody have anything they want to add or any questions they may have? There's been a lot of chat back and forth, but I hadn't looked at those yet. Let me see if I can find those.
Hey, Jason.
Yeah.
Steve Pollock here. So this is great information. You are obviously in command of this information. There's many of us out here, at least maybe there's many of us out here that work on a higher level. And the simplest, if I understand what you're saying, is if we open up the remediation plan, click on the 3 days, that's what we should do first. Click on the 15 days, that's what we should do second, and everything else follows whenever we can do it. That's really the gist of what you're saying. And
I'm sorry, go ahead.
And really it's we should trust in this categorization to help us make that decision.
So to answer the first statement, I would say, yes, that's an acceptable and operationally effective way to deal with patching. I think it comes back to dealing with, your when we start looking at the fully burdened hourly rate cost of your technicians multiplied by the hours spent dealing with patching, and that coming off of your top line margin for whatever the products you care to subtract that from, whether that's your standard service or whether that's, you know, your RMM platform and how it's, you know, how it's monetized. But being able to take the time spent or the real cost by simply using EPSS to do that, right? The goal then is to significantly reduce that OpEx, or significantly reduce the spend by that technician and the cost of the company off top line for keeping patches up to date. And I think it's a defensible argument to say that if we dealt with the first two levels of criticality, you know, 15, you know, 3, 15 or 15, 30, you can change some of those timelines, but the base timeline for EPSS, if you operate on that base timeline for EPSS, you deal with those patches within the timeline, you know, within, you know, an order of criticality as soon as they show up, then the likelihood that you're going to have a compromise related to a vulnerability is so incredibly low to not be worth at least the initial effort to do it. Now, if your automation systems will take care of the vast majority of those systems that don't have a vulnerability in the wild, they don't have a compromise in the wild, that we don't know that, you know, we haven't seen that in the wild compromise for that vulnerability has been actioned at any point. Nobody can point to a case where that has happened. And your client doesn't exist within what we call critical infrastructure right now. Anybody with intellectual property, patents, those types of things, those guys are under ridiculous amounts of attack right now. But if, you know, if your client exists outside of that, then the answer is yes. Deal with the most critical ones, deal with the others when you can. If in fact your RMM platform that you use for patching and its third-party patching application simply doesn't deal with a graphics driver or something, and there's zero risk to that graphics driver in EPSS, then my recommendation to you would be to leave it alone.
Thank you. Yeah, I understand that, but also then if a client says, "Am I patched?" You never have a clean remediation plan. You're always chasing it, and it's
Right.
nice to have a clean one. And again, the time it takes to update that driver is time that when we're justifying our higher cost for doing these things, patch management is probably the single highest cost there is in time wise. So, but thank you, very helpful.
Yeah, and I would say too, look at patching a little bit different maybe than historically. So let me ask you this question. Has the amount of time that you guys have spent on patching, has that gone up in any measurable number or any measurable amount of time in the last 12 months?
It has not, because our RMM is doing a pretty good job of we've tested and tested and tested, and we turn it up all the way. So it's everything. It doesn't matter if it blows the machine up, too bad. We heard it right of boom. Here's a tissue, wah. And so it's yeah, we love that. That was from that was because you can't spend the time to do it. It's not worth the time. It's much easier to reimage a computer than it is to have to put the spare in place and reimage the computer back up and running. So if I look at my largest client, the biggest exposure we have are on the servers, and servers are done manually. So if we manually patch manage servers monthly basis, yes, we're going to miss that 3-day mark, but we can check it on a daily basis. And if we can get alerted that a patch comes up that is in that 3-day window, that would be helpful too. I don't know if I'm missing that, but that would be an interesting way to know if we could see if a patch hits that 3-day EPSS score or the 15-day, because we're not checking necessarily every day. And then we can see that. But I'm looking at our largest client in the 3-day score. They have 200, and we're not that big. So we have our largest client is about 250 systems. And the most PC-based systems are 2 that have not been patched in the 3-day score. So it's a very small percentage of the total. So that's why we haven't seen our increase in the RMM requirements, but we're going to see it just to clean to that 90 percentile, to get that 95%. That takes 80% of the time. So that's the problem. But thank you.
Right. Yeah. So we do get some alerting in EPSS out of our SOAR platform, that data that grabs from Connect Secure. I can't imagine that, if there was enough interest in having alerting based on EPSS score criticality, if there was enough interest in that these guys wouldn't turn that on. But I can't speak to them for that.
Yeah,
But I would say to most,
actually commented on adding that in as a notification rule earlier in the chat. So we are going to probably add that in there soon.
but there you go. So I would say also, for those of you that are strictly patching by RMM capability, that has kind of been the historical modality to operate. I think that's by and large okay. I would say that checking to make sure that even with those efforts, that you don't have something within EPSS criticality still that have to maybe be dealt with manually. Here's an example. I have a client that has a 2012 R2 database that has an EPSS criticality of the highest criticality. And guess what? RMM's not going to patch that SQL version, right? So we have to be, we still have to kind of deal with it, deal with those threats that come up manually, if at all. But what I would say to most of you is, if a patch isn't handled by RMM or Chocolatey or Connect Secure, whatever it is you're using, to deploy your updates, and it has zero, it doesn't show up anywhere in EPSS criticality, and your RMM engine, for whatever reason, doesn't patch it because it's not in that list of applications. As a guy who lives and breathes security every day, and it's all I do, I would say, leave it alone unless there's some compelling reason to do it. Now, I'm talking to the non-break fix folks, right? I'm talking to the MRR folks who bundle patching within their core service that they offer their client. And, for those who do look at the cost of patching against their top line. Is anybody else kind of, or is anybody else looking at what I'm saying and saying, I don't think that's right? Do we have any counter arguments to it? I know if Felicia was here, she might have a counter argument. Felicia and I are good friends, but it's all based on, time availability, margin, and need and availability. So does anybody feel like kind of what I'm saying is, they just think they might have a counter argument to it? If so, I'd like to hear it. Yeah. If so, if you do, and you're just not kind of keen to talking in front of everybody, you can email me if you'd like, jason@sppartners.co. I'd like to hear some folks have some counter arguments against it. Because I'd like my thought about how this is operated within the patch environment. I'd like to see if that survives challenge. So if we look at EPSS again, it's a measure of threat. It's simply estimating the probability, right, that vulnerability is going to experience an exploitation. An exploitation activity in the wild is how they put it, but I just say exploitation. Now it says that it accomplishes entirely by data-driven empirical evidence. That just simply means that it gathers a multitude of data from other platforms and vendors and to determine the risk, right? So let's go, again, we talked about VMware Horizon. Let's talk about another one. Let's talk about the ESX patches that came out, and how that criticality ramped up so quickly over a 24-hour period. So we saw that the VMware ESX, patches came out, And when those patches came out, they had a criticality. And from there, folks began starting patching. But then we saw a compromise in the wild that showed up 24 hours after that risk was, that risk was presented. And so immediately what started happening, right, is, the platform started talking about the criticality to patch this, this risk, that it needed to be done immediately, that it needed to be taken care of today. Well, what EPSS is a culmination of all that chat and all that back and forth. And it's empirical evidence that says, hey, this is what you need to do. Right. Now, again, EPSS has been around since 2019. And so, that's not entirely a long time. But I think if you look at how the algorithms that they use, the open source data that they have about how they deal with these ratings, and I think it has survived scrutiny so far. I'm certain that that having worked with Shiva, that he did quite a bit of scrutiny on EPSS before adding it, as a platform to Connect Secure, right? And so if we look at CVSS, on the other hand, right, it's thought of as a measure of severity, right? So EPSS is a measure of threat. CVSS is a measure of severity. So EPSS says, is there a threat that I'm going to get, I'm going to get a whooping when my dad gets home because of something I did, right? And now CVSS is how severe is it going to be, right? So what did I do and how severe is it going to be, right? And so EPSS is, again, it's looking at the probability. How probable are we that this is going to happen? So so let me ask this question, try to get some feedback. And Peter, you may want to answer this because I know you spent a year working kind of in security and dev at the same time. So I'd be interested in your thought. If you have something that has a relatively high CVSS, but EPSS says that the probability of that threat being exploited is relatively low, right? Would you act upon the CVSS risk saying that it was critical, or would you look at the EPSS data and deal with it based upon what EPSS says? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah. I'd add in one third factor, which you could actually use by incorporating our tagging feature in Connect Secure. So when you do that initial risk assessment with your clients, it's important to kind of identify which devices are the revenue generating devices for your clients, or at the end of the day, what runs their business, what keeps the lights on. So I think prioritizing those machines is most important. And then the EPSS scoring is bringing into the equation, how exploitable is this particular vulnerability? Is this being exploited in the wild right now? So something that has a high criticality but isn't really being exploited in the wild is perhaps maybe not as dangerous as something that's actively being exploited but has a medium or lower criticality. Regardless, it's most important to identify and prioritize the machines that run the business for the company. Would be kind of the two bits I would probably add in there. I know what your thoughts are there.
Yeah, that's something I didn't even bring up yet. So that's makes perfect sense to me. Looking at the machines that are most critical to running the business, right? And I think, like was mentioned before, right, I'm gonna patch the hell out of them anyway, right? So and again, it goes back to what is the total risk, and can I affordably continue to patch away? I've always been doing it, right? And I think that's part of it now. Write a boom, but here, there, right? Deal with it, patch it, address it immediately. But can you do that, right? Do you have the tool sets and the functionality, the capability and the resources to do that, right? And maybe not. So I would leave you guys with this. I would say I would have liked to have had a slide deck, had pretty decent stuff. Like I said, I was pretty sick last night, so I didn't get to finish it. Ask for everybody's pardon on that. And I would say that if you're a one-man shop or a small shop or even, whatever, and you guys are really struggling with, getting patching done because you've got projects and you've got, tickets coming in or whatever, I would say, operate out of, EPSS.
No problem.
And
Just making
and
sure,
then,
that's all. If you're good, I'm good. Okay. Just be careful. Have fun. Bye-bye.
Hey, Tom, if you can mute yourself, that'd be great. Tom Deal.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I was muted. Sorry about that.
All right. That's all right. That's all right. So if you're really struggling with that, work with EPSS first. If you have the luxury of comparing the two, obviously, patch to whatever makes sense. As a CISO for a number of clients, my recommendation to them is start with EPSS, deal with that immediately and first based upon criticality, patch then to CVE, and then patch the rest when you have time. That's just my recommendation. So I appreciate everybody's time. I appreciate everybody's consideration. Again, I'm really interested in getting some alternative feedback to see if my position holds up to challenge. So I put my email out there. That'll kind of be in the transcript if you don't have it. And just give me a shout. I'd love to chat through that. Peter, Shiva, thank you guys so much for giving me the opportunity again to chat with you and your folks, and I'll hand it back.
Thank you, Jason. Yeah, thank you, Jason.
Hey, Jason, had one question for you. Could you report back when you hear from especially OCC, FDIC, Fed, as far as their opinion on comparing EPSS to CVE? We work a lot in that space, and if you have actually official word, we've always been judged on CVEs and
exactly.
That'd be really interesting to hear if there's an official thread from the three governing bodies.
Yeah, I'll be happy to do that. As a matter of fact, I'm talking with I'll be happy to do that. Yep, sure.
All right, Shiva, any closing thoughts?
I just wanted to thank Jason for the excellent session today, and really appreciate your insights on this. And if anybody else has any questions, absolutely feel free to talk to us. If anybody else wants to share some insights in terms of what they're using, etc., absolutely welcome to. Thank you very much. And just parting thoughts, we're going to basically be introducing a very interesting new feature next week. So basically next week's call will be interesting. So hope to see you all back in next week's call. Thanks a lot.
All right. Thank you. Have a great week, everyone. Bye-bye.